My thought was, this is a stupid way to die in the middle of the Nevada desert over marijuana.
October 2008, 3 biologists were surveying streams and terrain in a remote part of northern Nevada.
Here's our footprints right here.
They walked 3 miles through a canyon when something amidst the gray and brown desert stood out.
There was a plant that just caught my attention. It was extremely green, 5 or 6 feet tall, and looked just out of place.
One of our coworkers said, "Is this what I think it is?" And we're like, "Yeah, it looks like marijuana. That's what it is."
The men, 2 of whom wished to remain unidentified, thought little of it. But a few feet further down, they saw another plant.
He said, "It looks like that was cut and placed there by somebody." Then I got kind of a knot in my stomach and thought something's not right.
Suddenly, 2 armed men leapt up from behind sagebrush.
It was right here that the 2 men popped up a little to our left over here. They didn't say a word, which made me even more frightened. I could tell immediately that they were Hispanic. I dropped my walking stick, which is right here. We put our hands in the air, started saying no, 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 and started speaking Spanish and telling them who we were.
Seconds later, a 3rd man named Tony emerged with a rifle. He spoke to them in English.
He continued to interrogate us, ask us who we were, why we were there. I kept thinking if I turn my back, I'm going to get a bullet in the back of my head.
After 10 minutes of tense negotiating, the growers let the biologists go.
Here's an example of the black seedling trays they brought the plants out in.
The next day, when law enforcement rode in, the growers were gone. They left behind everything: shoes, food, clothes, trash, and 800 marijuana plants worth an estimated $5 million. A relatively small growth compared to those seen in the thousands in California, Washington, and Oregon. While face-to-face encounters with illegal growers aren't common, the situation represents an alarming trend. Armed and dangerous DTOs, drug trafficking organizations, harvesting marijuana on public lands and remote areas of the country's national parks and forests.
It's a big problem, and it seems to be getting worse.
Mark Pirtle is a special agent in charge with the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada.
We hear all the news reports about, all the drug wars going on the border right now, the murders and shootings and everything. And I don't think a lot of the public realizes that these people are here.
In fact, the Office of National Drug Control Policy estimates 65% of the marijuana grown in the U.S. is grown on public lands, the vast majority by Mexican cartels. They grow here because it's gotten tougher to smuggle marijuana across the border.
Somebody came up with the idea that we'll smuggle in our people to grow the marijuana, and it cuts down a lot of logistics. So now they grow it and they sell it right here.
Usually, the men tending to the fields camp out next to the grow for 3 to 4 months at a time.
You can see they have coffee back here, sugar, a lot of supplies, all the staples. These individuals are staying out here for quite a long time.
In addition to food and supplies, they typically haul in miles of hoses to set up elaborate irrigation systems.
See the water pressure that you can build up on these things? Pretty impressive. So that's a pretty good example of how much water these guys are using out of the creek.
They use tarps to camouflage their activity.
This here was the main processing area. When we first got here, these tarps were it was almost like an enclosed structure, and maybe a 20 by 35-foot structure. Almost impossible to see from there, as you can see.
Once law enforcement spots the fields, the growers hear the helicopters and run. The occasional arrest rarely leads to the top guns.
Unfortunately, most of the time, those arrests are low-level garden workers that don't really know anything. They don't know who the big bosses are.
But Rafael Reyes knows all too well who those big bosses are.
The most ruthless, violent individuals and organizations in the world today. These cartels will do anything, will stop at nothing in furtherance of the almighty dollar.
Reyes says marijuana is the cartel's cash cow, cheap to grow and extremely profitable.
The true and tried method of making money has always been marijuana. It's what allows them to further their bases of operations into other drugs. For example, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. They're all fueled by the proceeds generated through marijuana.
And if Mexican cartels are our biggest foreign supplier, then the United States consumer is their #1 customer.
That casual consumer doesn't realize what he or she is contributing to. Indirectly, our guys in Mexico are fighting a war. Cops are being killed day in and day out. Police officers that are being kidnapped, tortured, and murdered to further intimidate and break the will of the people and of these brothers' officers.
These Mexican drug cartels, how much money are we talking about?
Conservatively, in the billions and billions of dollars.
Each year?
Each year.
If you're selling it out on the street, how much would this amount of marijuana bring?
In the Northeast region, that'll generate approximately about $100,000.
This one package?
That one package. And when you consider the fact that to produce that was just a couple of $100.
That's an amazing profit margin. And the DEA says the cartels are extremely inventive when it comes to ways to keep those profits and reach their U.S. customers. Not only are they operating on public lands, but they're building elaborate tunnels that extend underneath the border for almost a half a mile.
From your basic hole in the ground to now highly sophisticated tunnels that have lighting systems in it, oxygen, have railroad tracks.
Whoa, railroad tracks?
Railroad tracks.
It's an endless cycle of drugs, money, and violence. One that a marijuana policy reform lobby says could be stopped in its tracks if marijuana were legalized, taxed, and regulated here, like alcohol.
Right now in California, you don't see drug cartels from Mexico setting up and growing grapes. They're not growing grapes to make wine to sell it because it's a regulated market. The profit margin's relatively low because it is regulated, and someone who wants to grow grapes can just get a license and do it.
The Marijuana Policy Project insists marijuana is much safer than alcohol and tobacco and should be treated in much the same way. Cartels, they say, would have little incentive to be here if there's no money to be made.
It makes perfect sense to end the marijuana prohibition that we've seen on the books since 1937. Yes, there will be problems with marijuana use. Yes, some people will abuse it. But the prohibition of marijuana is much more harmful to the user and to society than the actual use of marijuana.
And one added benefit, according to the Marijuana Policy Project, if prohibition ended and marijuana were taxed and regulated, they estimate the combined savings and revenues could be somewhere between $14 and $40 billion a year. In 2008, the U.S. spent more than $13 million on marijuana eradications, seizing some 4.6 million plants on public lands alone. Aside from the public safety hazard, they say illegal marijuana grows endanger wildlife and the environment. Among the fertilizer and food, the areas are littered with animal remains.
We found this in the cultivation site. It's a front left bear paw. It's been cut at the wrist, and then one of the digits has been cut off.
The government doesn't have enough resources to clean up the mess.
Stay back around the perimeter.
So they rely on volunteer groups like the High Sierra Trail Crew. Months after this 12,000 plant grow was found in Sequoia National Forest, the crew flies back to haul out the trash. The mess is practically untouched.
Here's what's left of some form of a rifle.
The team discovers multiple propane tanks.
These are a major hazard. If a fire was to start in this area, an unsuspecting fire crew that might march into here could walk into the path of something that would either explode or potentially shoot flame 15 or 20 feet away.
They find pesticides and chemicals, some that have been outlawed in the United States.
We don't know what are the long-term effects of these chemicals being washed into our water system. So these go into the creeks that feed the streams, that feed the lakes that we recreate in. A lot of people, hunters, fisher, campermen, are ingesting these pesticides.
Brogan and his team average 12 to 15 marijuana grow sites a year and have just been handed 160 more.
For every site that they find, there's 4 that they don't find. There's probably another 500 out here that nobody even knows about.
For him, marijuana is not a political issue. It's a personal one.
I grew up in the mountains. I love the mountains. And to see this, it really repulses me.